Welcome to the Truth and Grace podcast. I'm Mike Desmond. This is episode 3 of my Dueling Theology series, where I'm attempting to do a critical analysis or review of two different Christian systematic theologies simultaneously. Maybe that was a bit much, but here we are. So even-numbered episodes will be dedicated to an analysis of Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, arguably the most popular and well-used systematic theology in the Western Church extant. But odd-numbered episodes, like today, will be dedicated to an analysis of Charles Finney's systematic theology. As I have said, and will continue to say by way of reminder, these systematic theologies differ at a fundamental level. And I have said, and will continue to remind us, that neither of these systematic theologies are what I would consider to be biblical theology. And by this, I do not mean that they have no relationship to the Bible. What I do mean is that neither are taking the Bible, doing contextual analysis and study, and deriving theological applications from their findings. Rather, they are attempting different things that they are calling systematic theology. Now, systematic theology, in the form that Grudem is practicing, is a discipline of Christian theology that formulates an orderly, rational, and coherent account of the doctrines of the Christian faith. It addresses issues such as what the Bible teaches about certain topics, or what is true about God and His universe. Systematic theology, broadly speaking, shares its methodology with other disciplines such as constructive theology, dogmatics, ethics, apologetics, and philosophy of religion. Now, this is in contrast to what Finney seems to be doing, as Finney is viewing the words systematic and theology individually and literally, and is not referring to them as a single term. In other words, what Finney is doing is an orderly and coherent study of God. Okay, today we will look at the next chapter, really the first chapter of Finney's systematic theology. It is his chapter on moral law. In episode 1, we looked at Finney's preface, and if you haven't watched that episode, I'd recommend you do so, since it provides the context for today's discussion. As I did in episode 1, I will again highlight the importance of context. It is axiomatic to the point that it cannot even be rationally argued against, that over 90% of understanding is reliant upon a proper understanding of context. Context is everything. It is the key to rightly understanding anything and everything. Okay, imagine I were to send the following text message. Let me see here. Let me pull it up here. There it is. The following text message. You're amazing. I love you. Or if you want to do it texty, how about that? Now, there's a context where that text would cost me my job. There's a context where that text would send me to prison for life. There's a context where that text is deeply abusive. Or there's a context where that text is encouraging or edifying. Which is it? Well, it depends. And it depends solely on context. All right, let me get rid of that because we don't need it anymore. All right. So, that said, I'll remind us of some key things we should know before diving into this chapter. First, Finney is writing this systematic theology for reasons. He's writing against something. What is he writing against? Well, he's writing against the Westminster Confession of Faith. Why? He believes, as we talked about last time in the previous Finney episode, he believes it is presenting a false philosophy that is obfuscating the truths of the gospel. Secondly, he's writing for something. What is he writing for? He is writing for at least 5 things. First, the education of his students. Second, the benefit of studious minds. Thirdly, to help people think these things through. Fourthly, to answer questions of practical importance. And fifthly, to present the views he holds in opposition to those Christians with whom he disagrees, that he may be understood by his own words and not the words of his opponents. So, let's dive into this chapter of Finney's systematic theology and see what he has to say. All right, let me build this up here. Boom. Okay, so now this is Finney's lecture on moral law. This is the first chapter in his 1851 edition published in the UK, which I have on Kindle. I should note for you that the first chapter in the physical copy here that I've got, all right, this one's the 1878 edition published in the USA, and I only have it in print. It's different. The first chapter of this one is different. It is called Various Classes of Truth, and it deals with epistemology primarily. I personally found it to be very insightful and worth a read. It's not included in the 1851 edition, which I have on Kindle, which is a shame because it's definitely worthy of inclusion. But if you're interested in reading this lecture, it's available on the Gospel Truth website, which I have linked in the show notes, in case you want to check it out on your own. But now, in his preface, Finney stated that his lectures on moral law and the foundation of moral obligation are the key to the whole subject that he is addressing. So what we are looking into today is critical for us to comprehend if we want to rightly understand Finney's positions. So with that, let's dive in. All right, so here we go. All right. We're down here. Law, in a sense of the term, both sufficiently popular and scientific for my purpose, is a rule of action. In its generic signification, it is applicable to every kind of action, whether of matter or of mind, whether intelligent or unintelligent, whether free or necessary action. So, he just gave us a definition of the word law, and it's a good one. So keep this definition in mind as we proceed. Finney tends to work things through very methodically, and his entire systematic is systematic in that it is ordered and not systematic in that it is comprehensive or trying to talk about every conceivable topic, broadly. So, physical law, down here in the yellow, physical law is a term that represents the order of sequence in all the changes that occur under the law of necessity, whether in matter or mind. I mean all changes, whether of state or action, that do not consist in the states or actions of free will. Physical law is the law of the material universe. It is also the law of mind, so far as its states and changes are involuntary. All mental states or actions which are not free and sovereign actions of will must occur under and be subject to physical law. They cannot possibly be accounted for except as they are ascribed to the law of necessity or force. Okay, so a succinct way of stating this is this. Physical law describes how physical things must necessarily or by force behave. It is a rule of action. Examples are gravity, thermodynamics, entropy, etc. Okay, these are physical laws. Okay, moving on. Moral law is a rule of moral action with sanctions. It is that rule to which moral agents ought to conform all their voluntary actions and is enforced by sanctions equal to the value of the precept. It is the rule for the government of free and intelligent action, as opposed to necessary and unintelligent action. It is the law of liberty as opposed to the law of necessity, of motive and free choice as opposed to force of every kind. Moral law is primarily a rule for the direction of the action of free will, and strictly of free will only. But secondarily and less strictly, it is the rule for the regulation of all those actions and states of mind and body that follow the free actions of will by a law of necessity. Thus, moral law controls involuntary mental states and outward action only by securing conformity of the actions of free will to its precept. All right, so to summarize, moral law is a rule for action, and it describes how moral agents ought to behave. If you look at any precept in the Bible, this is what you should clearly apprehend. No precept tells you what you will, by force or necessity, do or not do. They tell you what you ought to do or ought not do. Okay, the essential attributes of moral law are as follows. So, Finney now lists and expounds upon 12 attributes of moral law, which are, I will just list them here: subjectivity, objectivity, liberty as opposed to necessity, fitness, universality, impartiality, practicability, independence, immutability, unity, expediency, and exclusiveness. So we're going to look at them one at a time. To define an attribute, we will use this. Quote, a quality, character, or characteristic ascribed to someone or something. So in other words, these 12 attributes are qualities of moral law. Okay? So here we go. Number 1, subjectivity. It is and must be an idea of reason developed in the mind of the subject. It is an idea or conception of that state of will or course of action which is obligatory upon a moral agent. No one can be a moral agent or the subject of moral law unless he has this idea developed, for this idea is identical with the law. It is the law developed or revealed within himself, and thus he becomes, quote, a law to himself, end quote, in his own reason affirming his obligation to conform to this idea or law. So to summarize this first point, Finney is saying that unless a person has an understanding of the moral law within himself, then they cannot be a moral agent. This is why babies are innocent. And while some developmentally handicapped persons can be treated differently, because they have not developed the idea of reason in their mind and have not become a law unto themselves yet. Or, another biblical reference point may be that they do not have the knowledge of good and evil. All right, number 2, objectivity. This one's important. Objectivity. Moral law may be regarded as a rule of duty prescribed by the supreme lawgiver and external to self. When thus contemplated, it is objective. So to very briefly just summarize this one, Finney is a moral realist. In other words, he believes that morality is real and objective, not purely subjective. Number 3, liberty as opposed to necessity. So the precept must lie developed in the reason as a rule of duty, a law of obligation, a rule of choice, or of ultimate intention, declaring that which a moral agent ought to choose, will, or intend. But it does not, must not, cannot possess the attribute of necessity in its relations to the actions of free will. It must not, cannot possess an element or attribute of force in any such sense as to render conformity of will to its precept unavoidable. This would confound it with physical law. So this attribute of moral law is central to Finney's point. It is one of his main points of contention with the Reformed tradition. As an aside, I don't know if the Reformed would actually object to this point. They would probably at least agree tacitly. However, most of the Reformed I've talked to, when asked the question, could Jesus have sinned, answer no. And this answer implies that they would in fact disagree with this attribute, making conformity to the moral law in Jesus' case unavoidable, which Finney claims confounds it with physical law, which is one of Finney's main contentions with the Reformed. So, moving on to number 4, fitness. It must be the law of nature. That is, its precept must prescribe and require just those actions of the will which are suitable to the nature and relations of moral beings, and nothing more nor less. That is, the intrinsic value of the well-being of God and of the universe being given as the ground, and the nature and relations of moral beings as the condition of the obligation, the reason hereupon necessarily affirms the intrinsic propriety and fitness of choosing this good and of consecrating the whole being to its promotion. This is what is intended by the law of nature. It is the law or rule of action imposed on us by God in and by the nature which he has given us. Okay, so I don't really have much to comment on this particular point other than to say that, yeah, I agree. God made us moral beings is essentially what Finney is arguing here. Next, universality. The conditions and circumstances being the same, it requires and must require of all moral agents the same things in whatever world they may be found. And again, this is kind of self-explanatory, and it's related to objectivity. Yeah. So I don't think anybody's going to object with the universality of it. So, number 6. Halfway there, guys. Almost. Impartiality. Moral law is no respecter of persons, knows no privileged classes. It demands one thing of all, without regard to anything except the fact that they are moral agents. By this, it is not intended that the same course of outward conduct is required of all, but the same state of heart in all, that all shall have one ultimate intention, that all shall consecrate themselves to one end, that all shall entirely conform in heart and life to their nature and their relations. Again, I agree, and suspect that Finney's detractors would agree, at least tacitly, with this. But this kind of starts to touch on some elements of the moral law that he kind of differs with the Reformed in. But we'll get there later. All right, so number 7, practicability. That which the precept demands must be possible to the subject. That which demands a natural impossibility is not and cannot be moral law. The true definition of law excludes the supposition that it can, under any circumstances, demand an absolute impossibility. Such a demand could not be in accordance with the nature and relations of moral agents, and therefore practicability must always be an attribute of moral law. To talk of inability to obey moral law is to talk nonsense. All right, this point is another attribute that butts heads with Finney's interlocutors. The Reformed doctrine of total depravity would claim that men no longer have a categorical ability to walk in step with the moral law. This would make men amoral creatures in Finney's view. Because if it's not practical or able to be achieved, then it is not applicable to you. If you can't do it, then you can't be asked to do it, is effectively the sense of things. It's not incumbent upon you to fly when you don't have wings. All right. Independence. Number 8. It is an eternal and necessary idea of the divine reason. It is the eternal, self-existent rule of the divine conduct, the law which the intelligence of God prescribes to himself. Moral law, as we shall see hereafter more fully, does not and cannot originate in the will of God. It eternally existed in the divine reason. It is the idea of that state of will which is obligatory upon God, upon condition of his natural attributes, or, in other words, upon condition of his nature. As a law, it is entirely independent of his will, just as his own existence is. It is obligatory also upon every moral agent, entirely independent of the will of God. Their nature and relations being given, and their intelligence being developed, moral law must be obligatory upon them, and it lies not in the option of any being to make it otherwise. Their nature and relations being given, to pursue a course of conduct suited to their nature and relations is necessarily and self-evidently obligatory, independent of the will of any being. So to summarize, a moral being must be subject to the moral law, or it is not a moral being. In this sense, it is independent from God, and even God himself is obligated by his nature to act in accordance to the moral law. This is what the knowledge of good and evil is. All right, immutability. Number 9. Moral law can never change or be changed. It always requires of every moral agent a state of heart and course of conduct precisely suited to his nature and relations. Whatever his nature is, his capacity and relations, so far as he is able to understand them, is required at every moment, and nothing more or less. If capacity is enlarged, the subject is not thereby rendered capable of works of supererogation, or of doing more than the law demands, for the law still, as always, requires the full consecration of his whole being to the public interests. If by any means whatever his ability is abridged, moral law, always and necessarily consistent with itself, still requires that what is left, nothing more or less, shall be consecrated to the same end as before. Whatever demands more or less than entire, universal, and constant conformity of heart and life to the nature, capacity, and relations of moral agents, be they what they may, is not and cannot be moral law. If, therefore, the capacity is by any means abridged, the subject does not thereby become incapable of rendering full obedience, for the law still demands and urges that the heart and life shall be fully conformed to the present existing nature, capacity, and relations. Anything that requires more or less than this cannot be moral law. Moral law invariably holds one language. It never changes its requirement. Thou shalt love or be perfectly benevolent is its uniform and its only demand. This demand, it never varies and never can vary. It is as immutable as God is, and for the same reason. To talk of letting down or altering moral law is to talk absurdly. The thing is naturally impossible. No being has the right or the power to do so. The supposition overlooks the very nature of moral law. Moral law is not a statute, an enactment that has its origin or its foundation in the will of any being. It is the law of nature, the law which the nature or constitution of every moral agent imposes on himself, and which God imposes upon us because it is entirely suited to our nature and relations, and is therefore naturally obligatory upon us. It is the unalterable demand of the reason that the whole being, whatever there is of it at any time, shall be entirely consecrated to the highest good of universal being. And for this reason, God requires this of us, with all the weight of his authority. All right, so in summary, this is related to a couple of points above already considered. I don't have much to add to this than what I've already read. I think he did a pretty good job of laying that out. All right. Number 10, unity. Moral law proposes but one ultimate end of pursuit to God and to all moral agents. All its requisitions in their spirit are summed up and expressed in one word: love, or benevolence. This I only announce here. It will more fully appear hereafter. Moral law is a pure and simple idea of the reason. It is the idea of perfect, universal, and constant consecration of the whole being to the highest good of being. Just this is, and nothing more nor less can be, moral law. For just this and nothing more nor less is a state of heart and a course of life exactly suited to the nature and relations of moral agents, which is the only true definition of moral law. So yes, benevolence or love is the heart of the moral law, is basically what he's saying there. I would agree. All right, number 11, two more. Expediency. Okay. That which is upon the whole most wise is expedient. That which is upon the whole expedient is demanded by moral law. True expediency and the spirit of moral law are always identical. Expediency may be inconsistent with the letter, but never with the spirit of moral law. Law in the form of commandment is a revelation or declaration of that course which is expedient. It is expediency revealed, as in the case of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, and the same is true of every precept of the Bible. It reveals to us what is expedient. A revealed law or commandment is never to be set aside by our views of expediency. We may know with certainty that what is required is expedient. The command is the expressed judgment of God in the case, and reveals with unerring certainty the true path of expediency. When Paul says, quote, "All things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient," we must not understand him as meaning that all things in the absolute sense were lawful to him, or that anything that was not expedient was lawful to him. But he doubtless intended that many things were inexpedient that are not expressly prohibited by the letter of the law. That the spirit of the law prohibited many things not expressly forbidden by the letter. It should never be forgotten that that which is plainly demanded by the highest good of the universe is law. It is expedient. It is wise. The true spirit of the moral law does and must demand it. So, on the other hand, whatever is plainly inconsistent with the highest good of the universe is illegal, unwise, inexpedient, and must be prohibited by the spirit of moral law. But let the thought be repeated that the Bible precepts always reveal that which is truly expedient, and in no case are we at liberty to set aside the spirit of any commandment upon the supposition that expediency requires it. Some have denounced the doctrine of expediency altogether, as at all times inconsistent with the law of right. These philosophers proceed upon the assumption that the law of right and the law of benevolence are not identical, but inconsistent with each other. This is a common but fundamental mistake, which leads me to remark that law proposes the highest good of universal being as its end, and requires all moral agents to consecrate themselves to the promotion of this end. Consequently, expediency must be one of its attributes. That which is upon the whole in the highest degree useful to the universe must be demanded by moral law. Moral law must, from its own nature, require just that course of willing and acting that is upon the whole in the highest degree promotive of the public good. In other words, that which is upon the whole in the highest degree useful and therefore expedient. It has been strangely and absurdly maintained that right would be obligatory if it necessarily tended to and resulted in universal and perfect misery. Than which a more nonsensical affirmation was never made. The affirmation assumes that the law of right and of good will are not only distinct, but may be antagonistic. It also assumes that can be law that is not suited to the nature and relations of moral agents. Certainly, it will not be pretended that that course of willing and acting that necessarily tends to and results in universal misery can be consistent with the nature and relations of moral agents. Nothing is or can be suited to their nature and relations that is not upon the whole promotive of their highest well-being. Expediency and right are always and necessarily at one. They can never be inconsistent. That which is upon the whole most expedient is right, and that which is right is upon the whole expedient. Whew. All right, so this was a very long description. And I've read it several times, and will admit that I'm having a tough time following the flow of thought on this one. Best as I can ascertain, he's trying to say that the moral law is in essence working toward the goal of greatest benevolence in the manner that is most achievable in the current circumstances. So that's my best attempt at a summary of that. All right. Number 12, exclusiveness. Moral law is the only possible rule of moral obligation. A distinction is usually made between moral, ceremonial, civil, and positive laws. This distinction is in some respects convenient, but is liable to mislead and to create an impression that something can be obligatory, in other words, can be law, that has not the attributes of moral law. Nothing can be law in any proper sense of the term that is not and would not be universally obligatory upon moral agents under the same circumstances. It is law because and only because under all the circumstances of the case the course prescribed is fit, proper, suitable to their natures, relations, and circumstances. There can be no other rule of action for moral agents but moral law or the law of benevolence. Every other rule is absolutely excluded by the very nature of moral law. Surely there can be no law that is or can be obligatory upon moral agents but one suited to and founded in their natures, relations, and circumstances. This is and must be the law of love or benevolence. This is the law of right, and nothing else is or can be. Everything else that claims to be law and to impose obligation upon moral agents must be an imposition and a, quote, thing of naught, end quote. All right, so this is essentially saying that every law, like the Ten Commandments, is a moral law by extension. Even building codes of municipalities are moral laws by extension. Okay, so that's the chapter on moral law from Finney's systematic theology. Allow me to briefly comment on why I think he is right and his detractors are wrong. Many of the attributes of moral law Finney listed are simply not acknowledged by Christians or Westerners in general. Primarily, I see many in the West viewing morality as only subjective without any objectivity. You can see many secular humanists take this stance. Here, let me transition to this. All right. But Christians also take this stance. For instance, many Christians claim that God is definitionally what the moral law is, or they claim a thing is good or moral simply because it is God who did it or said to do it. Here's the logic. Premise 1, God is good and righteous. Premise 2, what God says is good and right. What God says is good and right because God said it. Premise 3, what God does is good and right because God does it. So this treats morality as if it is arbitrary and subjective. Worse, let me pull something up for you. Okay. Westminster Confession of Faith. Here we go. Going down to chapter 3 here. Chapter 3, God's eternal decree. Okay. Worse, since the Westminster Confession and many Christians today claim that God ordains or decrees whatsoever comes to pass, this means that anything and everything that happens or that comes to pass is morally good or ought to happen. Okay, so let that sink in. Okay, whatsoever unchangeably ordained whatsoever comes to pass. Now, I should say, the second sentence is not true if this first sentence is true. Okay, so they have, in this thing, there is a non sequitur. Okay, like this, if God ordains whatsoever comes to pass, then he is necessarily that. And this is not true. And this is not true. Okay, so like the reason these two clauses exist is because they naturally follow from this, but they don't want them to necessarily follow from that, so they just ad hoc say that they don't, that this is not the case. But that contradicts this. It just does. Like, okay, I'm going to move on. So after you've thought about that, let's understand Finney's perspective, realize his view on moral law is absolutely correct, spot on correct, and it's critical for us to understand in our present day and context. All right, back to me. All right. Okay, so I posit that we should think of morality by a different logical construct. What is good is what ought to be, is premise 1. What is evil is what ought not be. That's premise 2. Premise 3. God always does what ought to be done. Premise 4. And conclusion. Therefore, God is good and righteous. All right. So next time, I'll take a look at Wayne Grudem's introductory chapter to his systematic theology, and I will try to do so fairly. So until next time, remember, Jesus loves you, died for you, he rose from the dead, and you can too. Seek him and you'll find him. Ask him to save you and you will. May God bless you.